So today we're excited to talk about institutions, individuals, and the need for effective decentralization in our privacy solutions. So our next speaker is a regulatory compliance analyst for DV Trading, a board member of the Multidisciplinary Academic Grants in Cryptocurrencies, or MAGIC Association, and he organizes the Monero Community Work Group. The Monero DEF CON Village, is that a typo? DEF CON?
Yeah, it's the village that we have. It's in August, earlier this month. We had 3 days of events there. Yeah.
Nice, that's awesome. He's also a moderator for the Our Cryptocurrencies subreddit with over 900,000 subscribers. Guys, please put your hands together for Justin Ehrenhofer.
Thank you. So, privacy, in my opinion, is really the second most important thing to have in a cryptocurrency. You think about why you want to have cryptocurrencies and distributed assets in the first place. The first is the idea of being your own bank, or the idea of, if I have money, I don't want to trust someone else to have to hold on to that for me. I want the ability at a bare minimum level to be able to hold on to my own funds and keep them safe. I can choose for someone else to hold on to them, but I have the right to hold on to them myself. For me, in my opinion, privacy is the second reason. The idea that you can entrust the network to keep your private interests at heart without having to say, oh, this company, let me sign your agreement and you're going to keep safe my information. So decentralized systems were actually used privacy and took advantage of privacy before Bitcoin came around. Most people have heard of Tor and I2P. These are distributed systems, decentralized depending on how you define them specifically, but ultimately it was a peer of individuals that came together that contributed to a network to protect privacy before we even had assets like Bitcoin that tried to add this monetary feature on top of it. So privacy is critically important in these decentralized systems, and I think that it is essential that we get them right in cryptocurrencies in order to provide the best protections for individuals that are possible. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, and I have a fun activity that we're going to start with. I'm going to skip over my introductions. The one thing I do want to note is that, yes, I spend most of my time from the background of privacy-focused things. So I've spent most of my time contributing to the Monero and Zcash ecosystems, but I'm also broadly involved with my involvement in a student group I had on campus, and also by participating in the cryptocurrency moderation. Recently, I've shifted over to compliance, so I'm actually implementing now a lot of the procedures that we have as an OTC trading firm at DV Chain in order to make do with all this information we can see on the blockchain. So this is just a little bit of my background. You can refer to any of that later. But I'm going to open with a quick definition, and then we're actually going to start with an activity. You see a few cards in front of you, note cards and pens. Sit next to those because I'm going to get you moving in a second. So I want to start with the definition, the difference between public and private networks and transparent and obfuscated networks. And I use these terms really generally because they're overly simplified. But people usually refer to public systems as those that are accessible to anyone and those that anyone can contribute resources towards. Anyone can host a node, anyone can participate in that network. There's no centralized agency that sits there and governs who actually has access and provisions access. Instead, it's open, and these are your networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum and most things you've heard of. Then you also have private transparent ledgers. These are ledgers that are run in a database somewhere by a company on one extreme level, where it might be, Amazon blockchain services or the IBM blockchain or other sort of projects that you've seen before. And on the other side, you have obfuscated. Now, in the case of obfuscated public ledgers, these are still ledgers that are available to the public. Anyone can participate in these. They're not run in a server somewhere that is only accessible to a few. But the information that is visible on those, that is discernible to the public, is not transparent. It's a bunch of gibberish in general. And you can't make use of it, ideally, as an outside observer. Then you have private obfuscated if you're running a fork of these type of projects on your own server, right? All of these are open source projects, so anyone can click a button and host it however they like. So the scope of this talk is mostly within the public blockchains, and My argument is that we really need to make these public blockchains obfuscated to get the best use of these systems for individuals and institutions. And obfuscated is a gross overgeneralization because there's a lot of nuance there that I'll cover in a bit. But let's start with an actual activity. So you have cards. I want you to take out a pen, grab one of the cards, and we're going to simulate ledgers here. So I actually want you to either write your name or a fake name that you make up in the upper left-hand corner of the card. That's it. And then in a second here, I'm going to have you get up and hand the card to someone else, and I want you to write their name on the next line. So it's going to look like this. Again, you have your name up on the top of the card, and then you're going to write to the person you give the card to. So I'm going to give you a second. Get up, walk around, meet a friend, hand the card to someone else, and record that transaction on your paper ledger. Okay. So you give it to the individual whose name, the second name you wrote. And now we're going to do this process again. So in this case, I gave money to Alice. Alice is going to write her name, and then she's going to give it to a third person. So she's going to write the name of the third person and then hand the card off to that third person. And so you can see we're simulating transactions here in a really crude way. You trade papers. So when you write their name on it as the second name, you hand the card off to them. You continue. Okay, and after you've done that a second time, I want you to do it a third time. So keep going. With the pen or the paper? The protocol? Shred it. Just. Okay. You can grab a new card or. You can pass funds to yourself, I suppose. That's something you can do with current ledgers. All right. So have most people done 3 transfers so far? Can you raise your hand if you have not done 3 transfers? All right, so I need a volunteer at this point. I need someone with a really common name to raise their hand and be my volunteer for this activity.
Real name or
As long as it's a common pseudonym or, yes, back there, what name should I use?
Reese's.
I'm sorry? Doesn't sound too common. Okay, we're going to use Robert, okay? So if your card says the name, okay, first of all, raise your hand if your card says Robert on it. Okay, so what I want you to do now is put a little star or dot or something next to all lines that say Robert's name on it. And this is to simulate that Robert was caught up in some sketchy past activity, okay? And most people are familiar with this activity now, and people are a little wary, so they're going to look for cards that say Robert's name on them, okay? And now I want you to do one more handoff. So go around, hand off the cards to someone else, see if people will take cards with Robert's name on them. I hear some negotiations going on right now. All right, just a few more seconds here, and then I'll do the debrief and ask you all a few more questions. Okay, so we're going to wrap up now. So I have a quick question. So who accepted cards with Robert's name on the card? Okay, so the four of you accepted cards with Robert's name on them, okay? Why did you accept cards with his name on them?
Because his name was on it. I met Robert, and I figured I didn't have anything to risk the trick to take from him.
Okay, so Robert looked you in the eye and was like, I'm all cool. You should take my card. Okay.
He would be the only one that would take the Robert card.
Okay, perfect. Yes, back. Okay, perfect. So you're like, hey, I was just told to trade these cards. Like, I'm just going to just take these. Anyone else? Yes?
I wanted to get first-hand experience what it's like to have a tainted coin.
Okay, someone wanted the thrill of receiving tainted coins. Okay, perfect. So who had trouble giving their cards with Robert's name to someone else? Okay. So the two of you had difficulties giving cards to someone else. Why do you think they didn't take it? Okay, so there are a few people that just said no, thank you. They probably didn't want to be called out later in this scrutiny session here where I'm asking more questions. So what if I said, hey, this card says Robert's name on it, but I'll like give you extra coins as a result because it says Robert's name on that? Who like originally might not accept Robert's card but would be willing to accept it if they were given a premium? Like, here's some extra money for your trouble. Okay, so there's a few names here that would say, okay, not at face value, but for a little extra, I'll deal with that. Okay. And then who would pay more for a card with nobody's names on them? A blank card that, are currently just accessible on the table. Okay, so we have a few hands that would be willing to be like, I know the value of this card is 1 Bitcoin, but I'll pay a little bit more for it because there's nothing else on there. I'll give them more product maybe. I'll give them a better value. Okay, so hopefully you're getting the general gist of why we did this activity. These transparent blockchains look very similar to the type of cards that we had. And you can think of the cards as outputs or transactions, whatever simplification you want to make. But ultimately on the cards, on the blockchain, you have sending and receiving addresses that are visible to all. So everyone can see, even though it's not Alice's name necessarily, it might say, this long string sent money to this other long string. And that is recorded there without any uncertainty at all. Furthermore, exchanges, for instance, collect IDs, social security numbers, other identifying information, addresses about individuals. So to me, since I don't know who any of you are necessarily, I might just see this address and say, okay, yeah, whatever, it's an address. But an exchange or other service might look at this and say, oh, that's this person with this ID who lives here, and this is the previous activity they're associated with. So they have access to a lot more information. And similarly, this red dot is the type of information that blockchain surveillance analysis companies would provide databases for. So they're going to say, we're going to keep a huge list of all the addresses that are associated with specific types of activity. We're going to keep adding things to this list. And most companies will subscribe to these lists because they don't want to receive these tainted funds for a variety of reasons. So that's one of the main reasons I want to give this talk today, is because the complication of dealing with these potentially tainted funds, whether it's Robert that's handing you the funds directly or Robert touched them several hops back, these are major compliance concerns that we need to address in the cryptocurrency community. So what might these things look like? Like in this case, it might say, okay, well, Bob was collecting money for a ransomware attack that they did, and so we're going to label it as high risk. That's an example of the type of information that might be reported to individuals or institutions that are trying to look up this information. However, most people don't know that for transparent systems where it's unusual for people to use privacy features, the privacy features themselves are often marked as high risk or medium risk, or it depends on the circumstance. So perhaps it says Alex went to a sort of ambiguous person and then it sort of hopped back out of this privacy feature to someone else. And let's say it's good enough that we're not able to tell too much about it. it still might be flagged as a risk to accept these funds because it's unusual behavior. And so in these types of unusual behavior, it might flag you to do enhanced due diligence on these individuals who are trying to take advantage of these privacy features. So it's one thing to say, yes, it's great to use this privacy feature if you don't want to reveal where the funds specifically came from, you want to make it ambiguous, you want to protect your privacy, but you actually might still have issues with these exchanges, with other institutions that you're dealing with, because they're going to look at it with suspicion in many circumstances. So, to expand on this point, I'm going to say, let's suppose that this huge outside box are all the transactions represented in this system. And this little box is what I'm going to call the magical box of privacy. It is awesome. When this magical box of privacy has no other limitations whatsoever, it's perfect. So let's say if you make a transaction within the magical box of privacy, let's say for the sake of this talk, you're good. That's not reality in most cases when you're using any privacy feature, but this is a perfect privacy feature. So let's say it's going to be pretty good. The problem is once you start doing other transactions, such as those that go in the box and out of the box, or vice versa, they're in the box somewhat, it's really hard for me to actually tell you whether or not the privacy you're getting out of these systems is effective. Will it be marked as high risk because you touch this box? Maybe. Will you potentially leak a lot of information about the amount that's being transacted or other information? Yeah, probably. So it's really hard for me to actually tell you what level of privacy protection this does. Usually it's probably going to be better than nothing, but to what extent? It's hard for me to say. And it applies so much on a case-by-case basis that it is super, super complicated and difficult to talk about when you have these optional privacy features. And of course, just for reference, if you have a transaction off on the side in the completely transparent realm, like you did with these cards, then it's transparent. Both of you know each other, you know you're exchanging funds. The rest, if these cards were all uploaded to some picture database after, you would know that they all occurred. The problem with these type of systems is, though, that very few people generally use this magical box of privacy. It's very, very rare, and that's a huge problem. Historically, and this is for systems that are built for privacy, preserving individuals who want privacy. Generally, about 90% of the transactions use the transparent feature, about 9% kind of use it, and 1% actually use it to the fullest extent that they should. And so even if you make a really good privacy option available, remember in this case we're pretending it's perfect, it doesn't mean many people will use it, and it doesn't mean the actual system will benefit significantly from it. So adding privacy features on top of a completely transparent system is really, really difficult. Generally, this is kind of what it looks like. And these are rough numbers based off data that we've seen on several different blockchain implementations. So on the left there, we have opt-in. I can use Zcash as an example. They're a mostly transparent blockchain, but they have a decent privacy feature that you can use. But only about 1% of the users take advantage of that privacy feature. About 9% somewhat take advantage of the feature, and about 90% of the transactions do not use the feature at all. In the past, under opt-out, Monero used to allow users to essentially opt out of its ring signatures. This is in 2015 or so. And even for that system, where by default they were enabled and they provided some protection, 2/3 of people opted out. To save an extra cent or so when sending transaction, about 2/3 of people said no thank you. And of course, these included large transacting entities like exchanges, like mining pools. They all were like, well, this affects our bottom line. We don't want to deal with this. We'd rather just not have to deal with this system. And so not only does this impact the users that are sending those individual transactions who opt out, it also potentially impacts users that are otherwise participating on the network because they have a smaller anonymity pool, or fewer other people to hide among that are actually using the privacy features. So again, this is a gross oversimplification, but in general, it's much better to make these basic level of privacy protections mandatory such that everyone has at least some base level of protection, and that users who are brand new to cryptocurrencies don't need to worry about having to follow a step-by-step guide that may or may not be difficult. They can just download any non-custodial wallet they want and go, and it will work. That's a lot better than opt out or opt in even. To give another example, in like real life outside of cryptocurrency, the EFF has a browser extension called HTTPS Anywhere. And this extension was really important. It still is important now, but especially was important many years ago when websites by default did not send data through HTTPS. So this extension forced the web pages to load information in HTTPS. To those who don't know, HTTPS encrypts the data before it sends it to you rather than just sending you plain text that the Wi-Fi provider here would be able to view and anyone else that would potentially be able on the network. So you can see here, ideally, the best case scenario is that the browser always had HTTPS enabled. So this is a type of opt-out scenario where you have to download this extension, but then by default it will send all the data over HTTPS, and the users themselves will be much better protected than they otherwise would have been. Compared to, imagine with Bitcoin now in a similar sense, we're basically asking users to manually type in HTTPS and check the connections every time. It's just not something we should expect most people to really want to or need to pay attention to, and there's a lot of potential for error. So extensions like these, and now luckily most browsers are supporting this type of feature, but it took a long time, and it's something that is an example of why the default functionality really matters for individuals. So how does the transparency of these blockchains impact people really in real life? And you saw a little bit of that firsthand in this example, and so I'm glad. But to give one example, the Bitcoin Wiki privacy section, under its guide on this is the ideal set of circumstances for you to protect your privacy, recommends solo mining your own funds. Who knows what solo mining is? Okay, so it basically recommends that you should compete against everyone else in the entire world every time you want to make a payment, and you need to find that block in the 10-minute interval, and then you need to then you have your privacy because no one knows where or who gave these funds to you. It just comes out of the protocol itself. Obviously, this isn't very practical for anyone to follow. It's useful in terms of creating a science experiment to say, given these assumptions, this is what it looks like. But these are not practical assumptions for people to follow as a how-to guide. So we need to sort of step back and say, okay, what are we actually asking of people in order to protect their privacy on these cryptocurrencies? Is it something that is out of reach for everyone? We can see that Bitcoin trades at a discount relevant to Monero on decentralized exchanges like BISC. BISC isn't a huge exchange, but it has about $500,000 to $2 million of volume a day. And to those who believe in efficient markets, why isn't the most accessible, not border-restricted, decentralized exchange an efficient market? Why is the price different? Well, the reason is because people are worried about receiving tainted Bitcoins through that system. So since you don't receive tainted Monero, it trades at a premium relative to Bitcoin on that exchange. People are worried about taking these Bitcoin that they then later might not be able to send to an exchange, and they won't actually be able to take advantage of this supposed arbitrage opportunity. Even though there's a price difference, there isn't actually an arbitrage opportunity because the non-fungible nature of Bitcoin comes into play here. Similarly, fresh Bitcoin, so those on new cards, those with no previous transaction history, usually command about a 5 to 10% premium. People are willing to pay more for coins that aren't associated with any other potential activity. Because you have to remember, you could look at a card now, you can audit it to your fullest extent and say, okay, I don't know of anything right now, I'm going to accept it and then spend it. Well, before you spend it, maybe something on that card is then later attributed to some nefarious activity, and then you end up with tainted coins that weren't known to be tainted when you accept them. These are severe risks for users when they accept funds, and they don't go away with transparent systems. So individuals and businesses are at significant risk of receiving tainted funds, even for completely legitimate transactions. You're buying your $5 drink at Starbucks, let's say. If I were Starbucks receiving a Bitcoin transaction, I would audit the source of funds that you're sending me before I would just accept them. It's sort of like waiting for a confirmation. Some people want to wait for a confirmation. Most people want to check the source of funds to make sure they're not receiving money that's directly coming from a ransomware attack or any idea of what they believe is tainted. So this it doesn't matter if the transaction you're specifically doing is legal or not, it might still provide less value to the other counterparty in the trade. So it's really, really messy. And privacy is really critical for business. So I said I work for an OTC and market-making firm. And we do not want anyone, especially our competitors, to see our counterparty lists. If I'm trading, if my firm is trading with several of you in the room, I don't want one individual's personal information to be leaked to another personal information, because we want to take that privacy really seriously as a firm. Similarly, I don't want my competitor to learn who my counterparties are, because then they're going to try and move them over to their sort of system. So it's critically important that this information isn't leaked as we're transacting with multiple counterparties, and that's really difficult to consistently do on a transparent network. It's a losing battle, right? Especially if we're interacting with these counterparties on several occasions. Similarly, what happens when we're trying to market make and we take Bitcoin that we're trying to sell on an exchange and then we send it to the exchange, but before we can trade it, since the exchange is waiting on these confirmations and so forth, people look at the blockchain and say, oh, someone sent money to this exchange. I wonder if they're going to try and sell it or trade it. And so as a result, people might try to front run these trades. And this is a real threat actually to market-making companies, because this information is all public. People try to get ahead of trades for a variety of reasons. In this case, it's for an efficient, them trying to front run market-making firms. And also, since, again, I work in compliance is actually easier for us if there's no history that we have to look up of coins. There is no specific US law that says when you receive a $5 bill, you need to know exactly every sort of history that's involved with it before you accept it for an otherwise legitimate transaction. To be clear, our firm still does KYC on our counterparties, so we're familiar with who they are and we're familiar with where their income comes from, and we're comfortable with the transactions that we're making with the individual. But for Bitcoin, we still have the ability to check where these funds are coming from. And if we have the ability to check to make sure we're not receiving money from North Korea, let's say, and we don't, then there's a potential liability for us, because we could have checked, but we didn't. So there's no law that says you must have information on every source of, every instance where these funds were used in the past. Instead, it's saying, well, why wasn't this part of your due diligence process? You could have used this piece of information. Why didn't you? And since this piece of information is available, it's expectant in the industry that everyone uses this information. So it's not the case that it's just us using this. Almost across the entire board, every large institution is doing this. So you go back to the traditional KYC approach where you feel familiar looking for the counterparty, but ideally for a fungible asset, you treat the currency as a tool. You don't just then pick up the tool and try to run it through fingerprints and stuff, because ideally you're already familiar with the counterparty. And again, who actually checks the source of funds for a $5 cash payment? The only reason you would is if the cash payment, for your $5 bill, there was a ledger on the back where it said names and things on there, which we know there isn't. So privacy is really, really hard to get across. And I don't mean to say that this is a problem that will just immediately be solved. It's something that needs ongoing and permanent, really, activism to help make sure that these decentralized systems have the privacy protections that people expect out of them and the protections that people need. Most people think of transaction data involving the sender, receiver, and amount, which is really important information to collect, but there's a ton of other stuff. There's the time of day you're sending transactions. Maybe you're always sending transactions at the same time of day or predictable. Maybe you're using a wallet that has some sort of fingerprinting information. The anonymity set of the system is only based off the users of the system. So if the user of the system are you and your neighbor just transacting money back and forth, it doesn't matter how great the privacy of the system is, because it's ultimately only the two of you. It's not that much entropy there. Similarly, how are you connected to the network? Are you connected over Tor or I2P? Are there other users that connect to the network over Tor or I2P? Or is it suspicious for an exchange to see a transaction that comes from Tor or I2P? So this is only breaking the surface of the amount of information people can try and look at, and heuristics only get better over time. So we need to keep patching these holes as people find them. And it just needs to be an ongoing challenge. It's really critically difficult. Nothing will ever be perfect, but it's a challenge that I argue we really, really need to take on. So privacy features might be an on or off switch for many of these cryptocurrency projects. You might have a button that says like send privately or send this type of transaction. But reality is far more complicated than that, even for good privacy options. You might have a really good, again, my magical box of privacy tool. It might be really awesome. There might not be any known way for people to learn information if you're staying inside that tool. But what about the times of day? What about the way you're connected to the network? What about the way that you are interacting with everyone else that isn't using that tool or is being a little bit more slopsec oriented? So you might be really OPSEC oriented. You give funds to someone who then makes a Twitter publication about a tweet about it, right? It ultimately impacts you. So there's a ton of real considerations that get in the way, and they're really, really messy. So I want to do a quick note on zero-knowledge proofs, because zero-knowledge proofs are sort of the real cool, trendy thing and have been for the past maybe year or so. And zero-knowledge proofs are really, really subtle, and they're really, really specific. And so I want to give a few examples to help demonstrate that. And then that way you can better interpret. If someone says, our blockchain uses zero-knowledge proofs for privacy, what does that actually mean, right? So zero-knowledge proofs are hot topics, like I said, but they are specific proofs, on the mathematical and cryptographic level, that address specific problems. So it doesn't mean just because you're using a zero-knowledge proof that everything is suddenly perfect, right? They all have varying levels of success. Some are better than others. You might think, wait, but it's zero knowledge. Well, that's a broad term. So some are actually more effective than others, and they each have a different set of trade-offs. Maybe one requires a trusted setup to implement. Maybe one is less efficient, so it's impractical. There's a ton of these actual real-life trade-offs that you have to make. Similarly, let's say, back to our transaction, sender-receiver amount. Let's say we make a zero-knowledge proof in the system that hides the recipient really well. And so, someone in the marketing department might say, hey, our blockchain uses zero-knowledge proofs. Isn't that awesome? And then you're like, okay, hold on, wait a minute. So you had the receiver, but what about the sender and the amount? This isn't a comprehensive privacy solution, right? It's just one specific example. There are zero-knowledge proofs, for example, confidential transactions. The name is really misleading because it sounds like it makes your transactions confidential, but all it does is hide the amount sent in the transaction. That's an example of a very specific zero-knowledge proof that addresses a specific problem really well, but it doesn't solve the whole problem. It's like your friend coming to you and saying, I just bought a new car, and it's really fast. Do you want to know why? It has an engine, right? And you're like, can you tell me more? Yes, indeed it has an engine. I'm glad it might be faster than a horse, hopefully, right? But ultimately, you need much more of the picture there. You need to know about how it's actually implemented, and then furthermore, how people are actually using it in practice. Again, going back to you can create this wonderful science experiment, but you need to translate that to actual systems that people actually use, since they are distributed and decentralized. There's no process by which you need to make people complete a test before they can participate in the Bitcoin blockchain and prove that they know how to send funds appropriately privately, right? Anyone can participate. So I just always like to clarify this about zero-knowledge proofs. They are a cryptographic term, not a marketing term. So don't think of it as sort of a blank check to say everything's good. It's far more complicated than that. So I argue that fungibility is the main goal in these type of systems. You can, even notwithstanding the importance of personal privacy and saying, I really want privacy, the idea of having to look at these cards and figure out where money's coming to and going from creates severe hurdles for business, and it's really frustrating. The idea of one Bitcoin not actually equaling another Bitcoin, or one Doge not equaling the same as any other Doge, gasp, right? It's frustrating. It's something that we haven't really had to experience too much before in the traditional finance sense, and it's something that we're getting re-antiquated here. A $5 bill is a $5 bill, right? But one Bitcoin isn't the same as anyone else's Bitcoin, and that's really difficult to cope with. And sending and auditing these funds and things sucks, because not only do you need to sort of either develop your own list or pay for a list of what's going on, this is an ongoing challenge, and the idea of adding this extra step in place is really, really frustrating. Bitcoin is, to use Andreas Antonopoulos' words in a previous talk that he gave, is fungible-ish. And now, as far as my opinion is concerned, I'm going to talk about why, in my opinion, fungible-ish is the worst of both worlds. So I've spent a lot of time dealing with getting new users involved with cryptocurrencies, having them download a wallet application, send funds back and forth. And on the compliance side I work for an OTC firm that has compliance checks on cryptocurrencies and things. So I can speak generally pretty well, I feel, in regards to how users perceive fungibility of Bitcoin and how institutions perceive fungibility of Bitcoin. So normal people will just trade without thinking about it. So if I'm like, I'll give you a Bitcoin, pull out your wallet, most people will pull out their wallet and just take one free Bitcoin without thinking about it, right? But then if they take those coins and send them on to an exchange, they might expose themselves to a significant amount of risk. Most users don't think about that, because if I just was like, here's $20, people don't think about that, right? It's fungible. $20 is whatever. It's fungible. It's fungible currency. But with Bitcoin, that's not the case. And so you can see how for most individuals, they don't think that this is even a concern. However, for institutions, they audit every single source of funds that come in, and they close accounts depending on where things go, even things that are several hops away. I know that that's a common argument people use. Well, what happens hops ago? I'm telling you, it's still going to cause enhanced due diligence, so be really careful there. So you can see that there's a huge mismatch here where users think it's fungible, but institutions totally don't. And the normal unsuspecting users are those that are at the highest amount of risk, because they're accepting funds without thinking about it, and frankly, they don't have the ability to pay for these tools or effectively audit the blockchain, because they don't know what these addresses are. They haven't compiled lists of things that are going on. So they are going to be the ones that are actually subject to the highest risk here. And businesses, however, still suffer from all the disadvantages of transparency. In addition to leaking the amounts, suppose I'm just a traditional retailer and I accept cryptocurrency payments, and then every month I settle back to USD. I send it to an exchange to settle back to USD. Well, maybe my competitor will be all sneaky and be like, you know what, I'm going to just give you like $5 just so I can know what your address is. And then they look at all the deposits and they keep track of how much money I'm receiving and where it's going to. Now, people will say, well, you know, multiple addresses, man, and like all these other things. But if it was a large enough business, they for sure will start to look at more than just what like a new address for use will change. They're going to try and figure out a lot more of your business, and since it is transparent and recorded permanently, they have the upper hand in learning information about you. And then the final point I really want to stress is that optional privacy features are just not effective for fungibility. Just because 1% of users use a wallet that provides a privacy feature that attempts to provide more fungibility doesn't mean that the asset is fungible. People confuse fungibility and privacy in this way. Privacy is important for fungibility, but you need mandatory privacy in order for the asset to be fungible, in order for anyone to really treat something differently, because otherwise they're just going to either ignore it, or like say, I'm not going to accept funds that touch this, or they're going to treat it in another enhanced due diligence way. And that's kind of what I mean here. So suppose you have, back to this pie chart again with the opt-in privacy features. Most services, like you see with Gemini, with Coinbase, with several others, just don't touch any of this privacy stuff. They're like, yeah, Zcash fully shielded, we're going to just not allow that. We'll take all this transparent stuff that we can audit, but everything else, we'll just ignore that, right? So without fungibility, in my opinion, we've actually created the same financial system that we have right now and before. And by that I mean for the digital payment system. If I am sending funds through someone digitally before Bitcoin, I had to use a centralized provider. I had to sign up, give them information. I needed to be at the subject to their potential closing of an account. They could prevent users from interacting on this platform. Well, if you have auditing companies that are going to be processing transactions and making sure that the funds aren't tainted, it's basically serving as like the Visa-style payment processor again. Instead of being used to actually accept payments, you use these processors so people are comfortable accepting payments. And ultimately, the end result is the same, in my opinion. So assets need to be fungible to avoid this problem. So in conclusion, privacy is a really difficult but essential property. I think that even if you don't care about privacy as an individual, you should care about why it sucks to potentially receive tainted coins, right? At the bare minimum, you should want to receive money that actually has value, right? And then individuals and businesses do need privacy to transact, otherwise they're leaking all the information to all of their competitors, they're leaking their income. It's just a total mess, and most people don't want to deal with that. One thing I want to really specify, though, is that the privacy nuances are really difficult to comprehend. So it's not very useful for us to create a 50-step guide for people to, reasonably have privacy on Bitcoin. We need to say, just do this and know that it'll be good enough for most use cases. It never will be the case that it's perfect in every use case. We're not there, and we may never be there. But in terms of bulk surveillance, we need to be able to point people to a specific solution and say, just use this, and you'll be reasonably okay. Rather now, instead of, well, if you don't think about it, you're going to be screwed, and if you want to maybe be okay, then do these 50 steps. That's terrible, in my opinion. It's a breach of expectations with what people are expecting, right? And this isn't the case of every Bitcoin maximalist or every individual who talks about privacy features, but it usually is the case that people say, well, I love the idea of privacy, but, it's just inefficient, right? Privacy will always come at the cost of efficiency. You're never going to design a system that is the most efficient that also has a privacy feature. It's always more efficient to just cut that out. So to that extent, instead of saying we need to ignore efficiency or ignore privacy, we need to find adequate midpoints that provide, the best value for individuals. But we can't just say we want to go all in on efficiency and then maybe privacy, because nothing actually will get done. We need to change that mindset so that privacy is on the same level playing field as efficiency. It's something that we're thinking about in all these comprehensive solutions, or else it will get swept under the rug. And then finally, in my opinion, without privacy, the open blockchains will be used primarily for surveillance purposes. Yes, individuals are able to take advantage of sending funds around, but you know who the real winners are? Those that are marketing firms, those that are data analytics firms that are checking when people are spending funds. Perhaps exchanges might sell anonymized, to some extent, data to other individuals about what purchasing habits people have. There is so much information that is revealed in these transparent systems that the real beneficiaries, in my personal opinion, are not the individuals that are transacting on them. They're the companies that know how to use this information appropriately. And so we've created such a weird situation in that case. All right, so that's the end of my talk. I have a few minutes for questions. My work email's on the top, my personal email's there, and I have my Twitter account there if you want to reach me there also. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.